taking a deposition. I can remember going with my dad and taking depositions. Okay, you ready, Michael?
Yeah.
Okay. Recording here, I think? Yeah. Okay, so we are sitting at Raritan Yacht Club on February 23rd, 2025. The people here are myself, Michael Carducci, Jim Mackevich, and I will say young Dylan Carducci, because when somebody plays this back 20 years from now, they're going to say, that old fart, he was there as a kid. So we're going to enjoy that. In the meantime, some of us won't be around for it probably, but somebody will enjoy it. At any rate, Jim, thank you so much for sitting down with us, and Michael, thank you for helping out. And we're going to pick your brain because you've lived through a lot of stuff at the club, and you're very eloquent about telling the stories. And there's some stories I think that only you can tell. I guess where we really probably best start is, how did you actually get into sailing and get started at the club?
Okay, my father had spent 8 years in the Navy, 4 years prior to the war, and then, of course, as soon as the war took place, he walked down there and they said, yeah, he had 4 years of experience as a destroyer, person on destroyers.
Where? South Pacific?
Everywhere. He as the war progressed, he was in North Africa with the he was up in Scapa Flow chasing the battleships. Then he was promoted from seaman to lieutenant JG, which meant that he couldn't stay on the ship. That's called the Mustang, and it's very unusual. And they rotated him to another ship, and he wound up in the Aleutians, in the Philippines, and in Okinawa. So now war's over. He gets married to my mother, 48 or thereabouts, and the question is, what are we going to do for vacations and things of that nature? Most of the people in Cranford, or not most of them, but a lot of them were buying bungalows down the shore. My father's attitude was, I don't want to take care of two houses. That's enough. So he started looking into sailboats, and in one way or another, he bought a Lightning, number 1482. He then did his usual investigation. He checked out Monmouth, he checked out Atlantic Highlands, he checked out Raritan. He ran into Doug McNitt, who's a name you may or may not know, and next thing you know, he joins the club. This would be around 1956 or 57. I would be about 5 or 6. My brother would be 3 or 4. So we had this 19-foot Lightning. As I recall, there were 5 Lightnings in the yard at that point in time. There was a guy named Irv Lewis, who was supposedly a spectacularly good sailor. There was a white boat called Mischief from some guy in Bayonne. There was a red boat, I think it's still at Richmond County, that was owned by a guy named Cutting, who is the cousin or nephew of Harold Cutting, or
Cutting's O'Brien, yeah.
There was a family called Diamond. Ellen Diamond was a Staten Island doctor. So we had these 5 boats. And on Sundays, there would be Sunday races. I remember also there was a couple of Thistles. Al Williams was a Thistle sailor who sailed with Nelson all over the East Coast.
So you're talking like around early 60s now?
Yeah, early 60s. So, well, no, wait a minute. We're still too soon. It's 56. So 56 to 60, the yard is filled with, not filled, but there are one design boats. There's a couple of Thistles, a couple of Highlanders, 4 or 5 Lightnings, some Comets, some Blue Jays, maybe 1 or 2 O'Days. Classically, on a Sunday, there would be a race. I don't remember them that well. I do remember once in a while that my parents would go racing, and they'd just take my brother and I, the 4 of us, would be on the boat. Nobody cared. We didn't have my father wouldn't put the spinnaker up. He had no clue as to how to do that. At that same time, there were some boats on moorings, but not many. There was no launch, and people, to get to your boat, you had a rowboat, and you launched the rowboat and rowed out to your boat. to bring it in. Also, at that point in time, there was only the float on the outer bridge side. There was no float on the southern side, on the South Amboy side. What I remember, if I wasn't racing with my parents, because my father had a crew, is typically the mothers with the kids would sit on that dock and swim. We'd swim there. Now, one more point, probably illegal now, is if my father didn't have a crew and my mother had a crew for him, they just left us here. Go, take care of yourself. They give us a quarter. Somewhere up here, a lady named Miss Ada had an ice cream freezer, and for our dime or our quarter, we would go get ice cream. That would be our thing. But then we would just wander around the yacht club and do our thing. At that same time, in the late 50s, there was a marine railway along the outer bridge side of the fence. It was two railroad tracks heading into the water, and there was a big winch, and a gray contraption, and people would run their cradles into the water, bring the boat up, the boat get winched up. Then they had these tracks, and they had these dollies, and I never actually saw it. We used to play on the dollies and the tracks and get yelled at, but they would jack the boat up, somehow get it on these dollies with these other tracks, and push the boat off the line. In the spring, you reverse, run it down. So that was
How many boats of that size were in the yard, would you guess, back then?
4 or 5. Not many.
Okay.
It's worth noting at some point that a guy named Paul Spence showed up at the yacht club. Paul Spence is some type of a scientist engineer. He had a boat, a 35 or 36 foot boat, that he and his wife and some others sailed across the ocean from England to here. Paul Spence had no teeth. He was a typical English guy. We used to laugh about it. What was that? Oh, mate, that was just another tooth. Don't worry about it. So he went to work for Stevens Institute of Technology in the where the boats were towed in the tow tank. So he was there, and he was here for a long, long time. His wife Nora Spence was a pretty good dry sailor. They had a Jet 14. She used to sail the boat with that. Okay, as we get to now, in that same time frame, in the late 50s and beginning of the 60s, the Red Grant Regatta was the big deal. They would typically get 100, I believe, one designs. That's what their goal was, to get 100 boats. I can't say they did it every year, but a pile of Lightnings would come up from Monmouth. People would come up with Highlanders, and they would have the races. There was a period of time when they said, no, we're not going to allow auxiliaries to sail in the Red Grant because they didn't want to steal the crew. So that was out there. And my father used to laugh that the budget of the yacht club was very much dependent upon the Red Grant and the bar revenue. So that was kind of what was going on back in those days. I also remember a story from my father, which, again, it's anecdotal, that when he first joined the club, some concessionaire had control of the bar. We didn't have control of the bar. And that was a big Megillah to kick that guy out and take control of the bar. Right or wrong, that's what I remember. So, in the right-hand side of the yard, on the South Amboy side, look, most of the boats were one designs. So you went sailing, you picked the boat out of the water, you put it on your trailer, you pulled it back, and there was a large building with lots of lockers. And that's what you do. You go, after you take your sails, your rudder, or whatever, and you put it in a locker.
This is the building we lost during Sandy? Or this is
This is a long time ago. Okay. This would be along the fence line where, where you have that ramp that goes to the beach. It would have covered that beach right to the property line. And I would have to say there was 50, 60 lockers in there. As the club got a little bit bigger, they started buying or building more lockers running across the face here. So there was a bunch of more lockers. And I guess all of those things, that locker room that I'm talking about eventually just kind of collapsed. And but it was sort of funny because there was a lot of arguments in those days. And I remember somebody saying, well, it would be shit up on the top of the lockers. People would just throw stuff there and leave it. Then somebody's talking about safety, and somebody said, well, every goddamn locker's got a can of gas in there. What are you worried about safety? It's not going to be cool. So that thing, as I said, eventually it just collapsed of its own. It just fell apart. Now, as we get into the 60s, the fiberglass auxiliary boats start showing up. We start seeing Pearson Tritons, CNCs, various 20s from 22 feet up, Cal 29s, 27s, 20s, and the boats more and more boats keep coming in that are fiberglass auxiliary boats.
Now, when you mean auxiliary, what do you mean by that?
Well, auxiliary to me is it's got berths, it's got an engine, it's got a sink, it's got a head. So those my father bought in '64, I believe. He bought a Pearson Ariel, and which was, I don't know if you know what a Triton is. A Triton was the first mass-produced fiberglass boat, and in one of the in those days, the New York boat show was in a place called the Coliseum at Columbus Circle. And when they first introduced the Triton, as I remember, they sold 30 of them at the show. I mean, a gigantic number. And they started building these suckers. We went up to, my father's a huge check things out guy. Before he ever buys anything, he checks it out 1,000 times. We actually drove to the Pearson factory up in Rhode Island to look at what he was thinking about buying, like how thick it was, how much how thick the hull was, and that sort of stuff. But any of that, he bought a Pearson Ariel in '64, $6,000 maybe. Him and a neighbor humped the boat from. Well, he paid somebody to go to New London. Then he humped the boat that weekend back to Raritan. But like I said, now Cal 20s is showing up. Cal 25s is showing up. Vevey had a Cal 25. That's a flat deck thing. A 20 is again flat deck. But then Rose Booz and her husband had Cal 29. Impy shows up with Cal 30. That A, he didn't put the engine in, and B, he had a tapered mast. So the boat was a little bit snug.
So it was a hot boat.
A little hot.
Just for the record, let's say we're talking about Impy Sinnett.
Correct.
Who is a recurring theme in many of our oral histories.
Right. Okay, so as I said, people just keep showing up with these boats from 22 feet to whatever. In those days, it was, how would I say this? You weren't cool if you didn't go for a week trip to the Sound. If you didn't go up the Sound, you weren't cool. So people would not only do it, but make sure everybody else knew that they were going to go up through Hellgate and go hang out, and do a little cruising up there. And we did a massive amount of cruising with my father, which to this day that's it for me on cruising. So that's what was going on. Now, they were racing these boats, as we saw here, and these things I have. Cal 29 Keg won the RYC single-handed. Ralph Heald's Cal 20 was runner-up. 4 auxiliaries. Ed Mackevich's Ariel won the handicap division, and Paul Kurtz's Morgan 30 won the low handicap division. So what we had going in those days, as I remember, all right, so A, you had McCann races, which typically were 4 or 5 a year. Then we had Compton races. Compton races were jib only, no spinnaker and no Genoas. So you would go out there with just your working jib. The idea being it would be less complicated crew-wise. And then, so that's what was going on in terms of the daily. And then they had the weekend. The holiday races. Typically, they raced these boats in a Red Grant. Now, so at some point, the Red Grant said the one design sort of petered out. They came and they went, but they petered out. And then we had Red Grants here where there was 50 boats, 50 auxiliary boats, all starting from the cupola to Staten Island.
What handicap were they using?
Do
Do you remember?
CCA.
MORC for some of the boats, and they had some early version of PHRF. I can't remember all that. I just don't. But that's what was going on in that regard. So there was a point when you were starting, because all the races started from a cupola to Staten Island, and there was a point in time when there was no limit. So people would be going into the fleet and running around in the fleet, and they finally said, stop, stay out of the fleet in terms of starting the races. But the races, 95% of them started at right here, went to the lighthouse, and then took out. And this guy, Harold Cutting, he would run most of the races. He would show up with his wife and maybe another person. They would start the races. They would finish the races. And that's that. I mean, we'd be out there for 5 and 6 hours sometimes with the light air. We started at 10 o'clock. There were plenty of races where you put the anchors out because there was no wind. Then the wind would come back in, and you're, beating or reaching or running or whatever. So that's what I recall in terms of what you're talking about. I do not remember when the South Down side float came along, but it came along at some point. As the more and more boats got into the fleet, they had a huge dinghy wreck. I can't even tell you how many dinghies there were, but somebody made the decision to go get a launch. Carl Gilman was the first launch driver, as I remember, and there was this weird, I think they call it a whale boat or something like that, where it only held 3 or 4 people, and engines in the middle. But then they began to get more launches or get better launches, and at some point they had something they called a ski barge, which was El Destructo. It was wide and a flat with an outboard engine, absolutely uncontrollable in heavy air with lots of people on it, and it would smash into boats and everything in between. That led to, as I remember, the next launch was the one that Mackevich has, the red one. They had that built at Manaford's, brought it here, and that became the launch for a long time. And then the launches just kind of evolved. So that's a little bit of what I remember about the background here. We had, as long as I can remember, we had 2 hoists. We had the small hoist in the middle of the bulkhead, and then we had a larger hoist that was made out of wood that was to the outer bridge side. And we used to pick that thing up. We used to pick the J29 up with that thing, and it would go. it would shake like you couldn't believe. So that's some of the stuff that I remember. So that's a lot of talking. So why don't you ask some questions now?
So did that hoist, was that pulled by a car or something, or did it have?
No, it was
have a winch.
It could pick the J29 up, so it had a winch, and it was probably 3 ton.
Yeah, because I remember there used to be wood ones that actually run the tail to a car and drive off. And
that I don't remember.
Yeah, but that's not what we had.
That I don't remember.
Yeah.
Eventually, they built a hoist they have here. I remember being at the big meeting, and this guy named Architect, he died on his boat in Greece or something like that. I'll probably think about his name as I keep talking. So he was tasked with Terry Blackburn.
Yeah, Terry Blackburn, right. Yeah,
so he was tasked with designing the whole thing. And so there's this meeting and I'm at, and he's saying, well, I only want to have this for like 8,000 pounds or 6,000 pounds or something like that. And the And the squawkers said, "What are you talking about? The boat's way more than that. We won 16,000 pounds or whatever the number was." And he goes, "That's dangerous." And Donnie Forbes says to him, "What, 2,000 pounds falling on you won't hurt you?" So they voted to buy the bigger lift, and so, but Terry Blackburn got back on us by designing it so it wasn't big enough to pull a big boat. It wasn't tall enough.
Or high enough.
So he just did it and he didn't care. So that's what that was about.
So you started racing with your father. When did you kind of branch out onto your own?
Okay, my father was pretty good friends with Al Williams and his wife. My mother and my father were good friends with them. Al Williams was pretty much of a champion thistle sailor. The old joke used to be Nelson was his crew, Nelson Macan, and then he would get crazy because Nelson would rip all the gear out of the deck and stuff like that. So they would go to Saybrook and Ohio and here and there. They would do their racing. Now, at this point in time, now we're getting into like early 70s, mid 70s. Impy starts showing up with the big boats. The first big boat. So my answer is, now Al would always be, whenever Impy had a night race or overnight race or something like that, Al would be watch captain or something. So when we did a race in 1975 from Sandy Hook to Norfolk, and I got to go, through Al. And that's where Botsolus and Carducci were on there. I didn't know them very well. I knew who they were, but they weren't friends of mine. So we did that. We got that race down to Norfolk, and then I started racing on
So this was in your teens? Or?
No, I was, I think it was in law school. I was probably in my low 20s. So, but Impy, let's back up a couple of steps. Impy at some point in time had 2 dragons in the club. The reason he had 2 is he needed somebody to sail against. So they would put them in the water and they would sail. Now, in 65 to 69, I was down here a real lot because I was caddying, working, trying to make money for college. But I remember seeing the dragons, of course.
What was the dragon? Refresh my memory.
The dragon is about
It's a pregnant needle.
28 feet, about 5 feet wide. It sailed everywhere. It used to be an Olympic boat.
Yeah.
Really
low to the water, very sleek, very wet.
Right. And this must go back quite a bit because what I remember, this is silly, but Barry was sailing one of Impy's dragons one time and crashed into my father's boat and put a big fucking hole in it. And people didn't get crazy. He just hooked the boat back up to his trailer and drove it home and fixed it. The hole was this big. I don't know if there's any money going on there, but they beat up our boat. Anyway, Impy then, at some point, got a Cal 40 and was racing the Cal 40. I don't know that much about it. I wasn't around that much when he had a Cal 40. In fact, at some point, he had 2 of them.
So this is before the CNC 30, or this was after?
I would say before.
Oh, okay.
Then, after the Cal 40, he got the Columbia 43, which he sailed here for a long time, and he also sailed it down the SORC. And they actually...
That was kind of almost a flush deck kind of thing, wasn't it? It had a really long,
it had
flat deck.
It had a clamshell to go down, but the freeboard had to be 8 feet.
Yeah.
I mean, it was huge.
Yeah, I can remember those. They were funny looking.
Right, and he used to sail it, which always confused me. They would race it with a high clue jib and an inside jib. And
Double head rig.
Yeah, even going upwind.
Right.
That's what they would do.
A lot of Ottawa books did that.
Right.
Yeah.
So he had the Columbia 43, and they had races. That was the other side of it. I didn't really get involved in that because of lots of reasons, but they had Jersey Ocean Racing Circuit, JORC, and they did races to Jones Beach, races out to to various places up and down the coast. They did a lot of night racing, overnight racing kind of a thing, and that's what they did. Al Williams told me one time they used to do a race to Atlantic City, And he said, well, they pay some guy, would give him a couple of bottles of booze and stand on the jetty and take the tons. So after he had the Columbia 43, and like I said, he did real well with the Columbia 43 in the Raritan Bay. He took it to Florida. I think he got a third in class in the SORC with that. And then he bought an Erickson 46. And the Erickson 46 was, again, flush deck, had big coffee grinders.
Remember
Huge boat. It's huge. That's the boat I sailed on to Norfolk. Then he got rid of that. Now, okay. This is a little bit anecdotal, but I think it's correct. So we're sailing. We've started the race to Norfolk. We're going crappy. Everybody's arguing. The back of the boat screaming and yelling at each other. We have Phil Holland on the boat. That's Ron Holland's brother. He's yelling. Impy's yelling. They're all yelling. And while everybody's yelling, the CNC 43 goes right through the front of him, underneath those tacks, and it's gone. So after this race was over, what I was told is that Impy and Al Williams flew up to CNC in Canada to go look at a CNC 43. And the boat they had was white, and he wanted a blue boat, and they wouldn't buy it. So they're, we'll paint it, we'll do anything, don't worry about it. No, don't want it. So now, here's where it gets a little funky. John Botsolus' uncle, Phil Botsolus, was, as I understand it, first of all, he was part of the management team who decided on behalf of DuPont to purchase Conoco Oil, like one of the biggest billion-dollar deals at the time. He was a big deal. He had been in charge of DuPont Europe, and he started out working for DuPont in Perth Amboy sweeping floors. So he was he was all about stars and one designs, and he knew Lowell North pretty well before Lowell North was important. So supposedly, Phil Botsolus ties Impy up with Lowell. And they had already bought some sails from Lowell for the Cal 40. Now they revisit Lowell, and that ties him in with Peterson and the two-tonner. So the two-tonner was in 1976. I remember that very specifically. I graduated law school in 1976. The SORC was in that winter, and they crushed everybody in the SORC. That's the boat that had the carbon fiber mast. Blah 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 blah. So they won the SORC with Lowell as the driver, and God knows who else was on the boat. I don't know whether it was that boat or another boat, but at one point, one of Impy's boats had Jimmy Pugh and Lee Killingsworth as bowmen. So those are the two best bowmen in the world. Jimmy Pugh is Rachel Pugh, and Lee Killingworth was deeply involved in the Australian 12-meter stuff. So they crush everybody in the SORC. They send the boat to Germany, and I believe they won the 2-ton Worlds. And Impy sells the boat on the spot to somebody in Germany, take the toolbox and get the hell out of town. So that's 1976. In the meantime, Mel Schott, a little bit jealous. What's going on here? So he orders a 2-tonner, virtually identical to Impy's, called Big Schott. Now, Mel had prior boats. Mel had a Morgan 41, and I don't remember what else, which they had taken to the SORC, and they went through some horrendous weather where they practically destroyed the boat. But so now he gets this white and orange Big Schott, which is still in Australia sailing away, still called Big Schott. And so now they're sailing back. Long dumb story. We go to the Annapolis Fall Series. So we would get in the van, drive down to Annapolis, stay at this fancy hotel, have dinner, sail on Saturday, sail on Sunday, dinners, things are flying, money's flying. It's just astounding. And Donnie Borup and Nelson would be in the back going, 10,000 this weekend? What do you say? Blew up sales, blew up the main, blew up everything. So then Impy says to me in the fall of 77, you want to sail on Big Schott in the SORC. He's got Bob Bevere as his driver and blah, blah, blah. I said, I've been only working on my job for a year. If I leave to go sailing, I ain't going to go back. They ain't going to get me back. So I didn't do it. I didn't go. Whether they would have liked me, whether I would have worked out, I don't know. But I chose to keep working. So that was.
You were not on the crew in '76 with Impy?
Oh no.
Okay.
I remember when they brought the boat back from Florida. We went for a sail, and we put the boat through its paces. Not actually. Knocked it down on purpose to see how everything was okay.
Right.
But no, I didn't sail that boat. That was Lowell North and his characters.
Now, was Lowell North from here? Where was his
Lowell
loft?
North Sails. They were
Right. Where was his north at that time? Where was his loft at that time?
San Diego, but they were expanding. They were putting lofts everywhere. They had a loft in Connecticut. They had a loft
Right.
all
It
over
might have
the
been
place.
Robbie Haynes and people like that at work. Yeah.
Right. So I don't remember who his crew was. So now Impy builds so now it's about 78, and Impy builds at Miniford's builds a 46-footer.
At Miniford. So was that an aluminum boat?
Yes, they're all aluminums, the ones that he had in that time frame. And he builds the boat. They get it down to Florida. At this point, Connors is now in charge. And they sail the boat in the SORC, and as I remember, they got second or third. The boat comes north, and we sailed a couple of races in it. I sailed like the Vineyard race and the Ebnu race, and a couple of races like that we raced on. And then I don't remember what happened to that boat. It got obviously sold. Then he builds a third 46. Or the second 46, his third boat on the sequence. That boat never comes near New Jersey. That boat goes to Florida, goes to Europe, goes to Sardinia Cup. Now, here's a story for the ages. Guy just died, the Aga Khan. The Aga Khan was one of the richest people in the world. He's the one that founded, created Port of Cherville. And he decides to have a race, a regatta, called the Sardinia Cup. He pays all the boat owners to put their boats on ships and bring them to Sardinia. But let's back up 2 seconds. Impy Sinnett's home, his commercial hub, was this broken down gas station on Route 1 right near Menlo Park Mall. And they would go to lunch, and he would leave somebody behind, like his brother-in-law or somebody like that, to answer the phones. So they come back from lunch, and he calls. Yeah, some guy named Augie Khan called. He goes, who the hell is Augie Khan? Is that the guy we sold the transmissions to? F him, we're not going to give him that. He's not getting any credits, blah, 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 blah. And they call the number, and it's the Aga Khan. So Augie got the call in. So he did, and Connors ran that boat in the Sardinia Cup, and I can't tell you where else. So now he gets rid of the 46. I don't remember if there probably was a separation, but then he builds the 48. The 48 is the boat that got him in trouble.
And what type of boat was that? Who made that?
It was a Peterson aluminum 48-footer. Essentially the same sail plan, the same everything, except it's bigger. Mm-hmm. It's going faster. This one's got a coffee grinder. And Blackhauler starts taking over that boat. And Botsolus was sailing on it to Bermuda. And he said they made some record where they got to Bermuda the fastest boat under 48 feet, under 50 feet ever. That was the year that Holger Dansky or something like that with some weird rating won the regatta, but they were first in whatever their IOR or whatever their thing was. But Blackhauler did that one. John told me this story, right or wrong, good or bad. He said, so you had Peter Barrett and you had Blackhauler. So just two of the best drivers in the world. It's night. The wind comes back a little bit. Spinnaker up, pull an head stay, whole boat, entire boat, no washes, on the back rail. And he said the only two people in the world that could have drove that boat in those conditions were those two guys. And he said that, so somebody's got it for an hour. Then the other guy comes in, goes underneath the arm, and they steer together for a few minutes. So the new guy gets a feel for it, and then the other guy peels away. And that's how they did it all night. Ed Liberty told me that on Tern, they didn't put the spinnaker up for 12 hours later. But they had the spinnaker up going hell for leather in the middle of the night with huge waves and big water. So that was the 48. So the 48, and you know what? That's Blackhauler with the 48. I'm a little bit fuzzy on this. I don't remember if definitely Connors ran the 48 in Florida. Definitely. And what happened is that they got third in the SORC. They were beaten by Bert Keenan with a guy a boat called Acadia, which was about a 40-footer, and they were beaten by maybe Louisiana Crude. Not 100% sure of that. Yeah. So those three boats are going to go to the Admiral's Cup. That was the deal. So somebody says, well, before you guys go to the Admiral's Cup, we should remeasure. And they do some preliminary measurements, and the numbers, nothing works for all three boats. So they quote, whoever the they is, tells them, send the boats back to Fort Lauderdale. We want to do this very carefully. Digression. Impy's not there. Impy's in Lenox Hospital having a heart attack, having open heart surgery, which resulted in his left arm being paralyzed for a while. He's not there. So they decide to double check their ratings. Dreyfus, who owned Louisiana Crude, he takes a grinder and grinds down all the bumps and anything else that might allow you to reproduce the rating. And just tells them, here, too bad, so sad. But Keenan is very indignant. I'm not a cheater, bullshit. He hires Herman Freres to explain all this, which I got to see because I sued the United States Yacht Race Union for defamation. In September of 81, or October of 81, I sued the U.S. Sailing for defamation.
This was after Impy had been tossed?
Yes, they had
So
tossed.
maybe if that would back up and mention that what happened as a result of that.
Okay, as a result of whatever it is that they did and whatever investigation they did, that's where the Harvey Ward stuff, that was the BN. The Harvey Ward stuff comes in, I put 2,000 gallons of water in the bilges. That's what he's told these characters. And so they very legally said that Keenan and Impy are suspended from racing for unexplained differential in their rating. Impy, he's half out of it. He writes some silly letter. I don't know what you're talking about. Dennis Connors writes a 2-paragraph letter that says, I don't know anything. This is the guy who just published a book, No Excuse to Lose. This is the guy who was sailing on an identical 48-footer in San Diego that had a 1 foot higher rating. This is the guy who said, I don't know nothing. So they banned Keenan for 1 year and Impy for 2. Can you give me some water? Thank you. So, let me tell you about what Keenan said. Well, not Keenan, what Freres wrote.
Go ahead.
Fran said, this whole thing arises from your Mark 3A algorithm. Sometime in the beginning of that year, I guess that's 78 or 79, you guys played with the math on the IOR rating. And the intent of the play with math was that if the boat sits deeper in the water, it must be heavier, therefore it must be slower. And I remember Impy got a phone call way before the races saying his rating went down 0.9. He didn't know why. It just happened. Why? Because the Mark 3A algorithm gave him a 0.9. So now what Herman Frere said was, when you remeasured and the numbers, as far as he was concerned, the measuring guys didn't measure it right. And that once you moved the numbers a little bit, the Mark 3A kicked out. So now the 0.9 disappeared. So yeah, there was a big change. But it has to do with the mathematical algorithm. It had nothing to do with cheating. Now, as part of the lawsuit, Impy had sold the boat by this time to some rich guy from Long Island, or from Westchester, I forgot it. Guy had a newspaper or something like that, whatever. I went there at 5 o'clock in the morning at Directors in a fall day. And I had a guy named Bruce McPherson who used to work in the work for Sparkman and Stevens and was a certified measurer. And I had a guy named John Marshall, not the Marshall from North Sales, but John Marshall was a boat designer. He was a naval architect. So I brought those two guys, plus a bunch of kids, and we reconfigured the boat according to the way it should have been, and we started filling the bilges with water. At some point, the water was going up into the bow and was about to ruin they have a thing called that changes the direction of the stay of the shaft. So there was an IOR rating credit if the deeper your shaft was. So they worked the engine so it went forward, did a change, and then got lower from the bow. But the water was coming up. There's no way that an IOR measurer could have not seen that. Equally significant to me, there were 4 ratings. We charted them because the numbers are always a little bit different. In order for Impy's boat to have the rating that they attributed to it, the bow would have had to look like this. The bow would have had to have been down.
Knuckled.
Yeah, I mean, ridiculous. I went up and talked to the measurer. I forgot his name. He was a pretty famous guy. He denied he made any mistake. I said, well, look at this. But fundamentally, our view in our lawsuit, which got blown out in 2 seconds, was that you people don't know what you're talking about. The Mark 3A is the whole problem here, not Impy, not Bert Keenan, not anybody. So Impy sat on the beach for 2 years. Like I said, I sued for defamation. They hired Pitney, Hardin and Kemp, which at that time was the biggest law firm in the state. Pitney's father was a Supreme Court justice, and the Pitney that was there then was a member of the New York Yacht Club, blah, 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 blah. And they got an order from the judge prohibiting me from taking discovery, then taking Impy's deposition, then making a motion for summary judgment. And and the judge found that Impy was a cheater. Even if he wasn't a cheater, they were privileged to do what they wanted to do, and blah blah blah. It was a nightmare. I got rolled like you can't believe. So, and they lied. They said this has nothing to do with cheating. Blah blah blah. And I got transcripts from their meetings with Harvey Ward and others. Oh, this is all about cheating.
So what was he? So go on with the rest of your story about Impy's career 2 years later.
All right. Well, so he sat on the beach for 2 years. Mm-hmm. After that, he got back into sailing. He bought a J30, then he bought a J29, then he bought a J35, and that's I think he had the J35 when he passed.
And you also sailed a lot with Botsolus, right?
Constantly. We
Talk about that a little bit.
Okay, let's back up 2 steps. I want to talk about something else which is hilarious. If you look at our esteemed Commodores, there's a guy named Dick Farkas in there somewhere. And Dick Farkas got a lot of members to give him money for an investment. Took the money, went to Europe, and never came back. So he was the guy with the two yellow Highlanders. There was a third Highlander, which was black, which is owned by Botsolus. Okay, so John's father, Chris Botsolus, was kind of he was an entrepreneur and he was an inventor. And he came up with the idea of building this Topher boat from scratch. So he had a factory in Edison. He put 2 or 3 guys on it. The boat probably cost $100,000 to build it because he had 2 or 3 guys working on it for a year. They took just to answer the question, they took etchels and they made a female mold from the etchels. And then they raised the freeboard by 6 or 8 inches because they wanted it to meet both IOR and MORC. So the reason that the stern went like that was to make it 2911, and the reason there was that silly hump in the middle was the IOR rule said there has to be 6-foot headroom. So that was the one spot in the boat that had 6-foot headroom. So after the regatta in going to to Virginia, to Norfolk, I began to sail with him and John on Topher. And it was a continuing evolution of different things that we were changing. Look, when the boat first started, his father first built it, he used a standard Etchells mast, had a standard 3/4 size spinnaker, and he had the inside, where the jib was a couple of feet back from the bow. So we went with a masthead wire. We had this high-clue jib, all with snaps on it. So, and again, these are a lot of point-to-point races, a lot of jib reaching. So as soon as we would turn the corner on a jib reach, this boat put the high-clue jib up, and we put the inner jib up, and we go faster than a 40-footer. Then we went for a masthead spinnaker. And again, we had no money. The spinnakers we had were shit. But eventually I got to a point where I bought a spinnaker for the boat from North. And when we put it up, we go, the spinnaker is too small. I mean, where's all this space that we're looking underneath the sail? Because the old spinnakers used to just sag. We had Lenny's, we called it the African American shoe. It was yellow, black, and green. And he had it for one of his boats, and we bought that for $50. So we used to use that until we could afford a new spinnaker. So we were sailing Topher all over the place. In '75, there was no Wednesday night races here. There were Wednesday night races in Lake Highlands. I had a job as a law clerk that I convinced. They didn't want to hire me. I said, look, just give me 2.5 days. So I would leave Wednesday at noon. We'd come down here. We'd sail to Lake Highlands, race the Wednesday night race. Sometimes we'd sail home, get home very late. Sometimes we would just leave the boat on some mooring that we just grabbed. We eventually brought a dinghy up there just for that purpose. So we sailed all the time up there because they had a lot more races going on, and they had Wednesdays and we didn't have it. So we were killing them. We were crushing them. And they protested us one time for having too much sail up. They protested me for hiking when I was just standing on the side of the boat. It was healing. It was pretty ridiculous. So we were doing that Wednesday night stuff, particularly in '75, a little bit in '76, but not as much because we all just got busy. So yeah, I sailed on Tofa. Okay, so now to answer your question in a different way, I forgot what year it was. There was a Bay Championship. Red Grant, Keyport, Richmond County, Atlantic Highlands, the under the bridge race, the one up in Richmond County, and there was a couple more. And we won 14 out of 15 races, or whatever it was. We knew we were going to get slaughtered on the rating. So now John's selling J29s. We say, well, let's buy a J29.
From Impy?
Yeah. And we'll win, confident enough, we'll win a bunch of races. They can't get a J29 for a year. They're backed up. We'll sell our J29, we'll sell for free for a year, or he makes the money. That's why it's for sale. It was always for sale. Except that nobody bought it. So after about 2 or 3 years, Mike and John said, no mas, we want nothing to do with this goddamn boat. And so I wound up taking it over. Fundamentally, I took it over because we borrowed 105% of the value of the cost of the boat. So I wound up taking the boat over, and I put a student driver thing on the back of the boat and started driving.
And Kajowski bought Tophet somewhere around there.
More than 10 years later,
Oh, okay.
Toph sat in a marina where John worked in Tom's River with a tree coming out of it and all sorts of, it was awful. And he decided that he would resurrect it. And that's what he did. And he attributes the job that he did to making his son, got his son back on the straight and narrow because he was kind of not doing well, in any way. So yeah, that's what that's my Botsolus story.
So why'd you choose the 29?
Oh man, that boat is the best. If you look, I still look at it and say it's fast as hell. It looks great. It looked like the fastest thing we could buy. Again, see, the 24s were just kind of coming along. And 24s were like little versions of the 29 or the 30.
So this is what, 84-ish?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this boat is fast. It's great. And
Why did you buy the fractional?
cheap.
Ah, okay.
It was the cheapest boat we could get. Fractional rig with outboard. That was the cheapest one they sold. Okay. And that year, there were 7 of them. There were 7 fractional outboards here in the bay. So we did a lot of racing against each other.
So, any big names? Any names that are still around?
Lockwood had one.
Okay.
Not with his money, with somebody else's money. There was a guy from Richmond County had one. That guy Reeves, your buddy, he had one. Don Schwartz had one. That's what I remember quickly off the top of my head. Impy had one. So that's 6. There's probably somebody else out there.
Cool. So let's shift gears a little bit. So, you've been part of the RYC family, if you want to call it that, for a long time. You raised your daughter in the club and stuff. How do you think the club has changed as far as a community? Or tell us about it as a community to start with. Like you talked about when you were growing up, kids ran around in the yard and did kid things while their parents went out and went sailing. What about when Katie was little?
Okay, so my answer to some level is that nothing in Katie's life, whether it was softball or sailing or anything else, was not done without adult supervision. Okay, that's just the reality. Yeah. So there was little to no adult supervision. Back when I was little, we would go down that hill next to the steps, and we would just do shit. We would go to the beach, the so-called beach down the other end of the thing. I personally was never part of the junior program. My parents lived in Cranford, it's 25 miles away. They had one car. There was no way they were. So I can't tell you what went on in the with that. How has it changed? Well, the good news is that we got to 350 members at one point. People were into sailing. They were into buying these fiberglass boats that lasted forever. We had the launches. We had 24-hour launch service. I mean, it seemed pretty cool. And then the economy kind of went down, and the COVID came along. Oh, and the hurricane came along. And 40 boats, 30 boats got wiped out by the hurricane. And people lost interest. That's all I can say. So how has it changed? A lot less people are interested. That's my answer. The percentage of people who race is about the same as it always was, which is maybe 20%. That's my answer. We need A, more people, and B, I like the idea, and I'm impressed by it, that there is a lot of energy into education. That's not something that was ever happening around here in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. That was just not happening. What was happening in those days was Billy Lockwood getting pissed off at Marcus Siskin for allegedly not having his finish time right, punching Mark in the face. That's the old legacy. Certainly, the drinking has radically reduced from the old days. But I think the education thing is a really good thing.
Well, you were also, part of your story is also your friendship with Nelson, right? There aren't as many people around now as used to be who remember, and it wasn't that long ago, all those years that you had Nelson on your boat going along when he kind of got too old to sail his own program.
I announced one time that I'm taking Nelson on the Macan races, and if you don't like it, talk to Jeremy.
That's how I got with Jim is the Macans. So.
Same thing with my daughter. Honestly, so I'm bringing Katie out. You have 8 people are allowed on the boat, and there's Katie, number 9. And people start complaining. I said, she's 55 pounds. She's 8 years old. You got a problem with that? Go ahead and protest me. Have at it. And next thing you know, they made a rule that said if you're not 15, you don't count. Those are 2 things that I personally did to make sure that Nelson could keep sailing and that little kids could sail without any issues.
So what's your crew been like over the years?
There have been years where it was thin, and there's been years where it was great. We had a good run where I had these 2 guys, and plus I had Dennis Flynn and Ed Brennan and those, and we had a full crew.
We had Tommy for a long time too.
We did. Well, yeah, there was a period of time we had Tommy and Lopez. So, the people have stayed. Tom Jones has been there 20 years. Karen's been there probably the same. I've never said no to somebody who wants to take a ride.
It's true.
Well, Jim, you get the last word if there's anything you want to say. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap it up and give you a chance to take a break, and we can always come back and do another one if we decide we need more stories.
One other point I want to make is that in 1976, Williwaw, Big Schott, and Tern, which was the Golden Daisy, were sitting on the mooring. How cool was that? That was very cool. 3 of the fastest boats in the world were sitting on our moorings.
Yeah, it was cool.
A lot of history.
Let's make it happen again.
We'll let you go. But Wednesday nights. When did Wednesday nights start up in the club? And I did not know that.
Well, they started
wasn't
out
going
as
to
one
the
design
semis.
racing, and then they transferred.
I would say like 79 or 80. 100% right. So J24s were going out there. 2 or 3 J24s went sailing. I remember one time, Botsolus and me and Kajowski said, heck with this. And we put the sails up for Tofa, and we went and sailed against them. Of course, we were miles in front of them. And then we went down to Madagascar and got drunk. But, yeah, I mean, that was just a little bit. Gene Lopez, and then, of course, Wednesday nights at Atlantic Highlands was no spinnaker. And started off here, no spinnaker. And then Gene Lopez said spinnakers. And the Vevies and they were all whining and bitching and moaning, and that's going to hurt the sport, you're not going to have crew, blah, 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 blah. It's the greatest thing ever. I think we as a yacht club became much more able to handle spinnakers than these other clubs that race without them.
So that was what, Air Force and the Serendipity 43? That was Fame?
Yeah, Air Force. Well, everybody. I mean,
Yeah, but there are a lot of people. Yeah.
once they said,
J30.
we're
Yes.
gonna sail with spinnakers, we just did. And there was a B fleet if you don't want spinnakers. End of story. But I think it really improved the quality of the sailing.